Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts.
Hey everyone, welcome to the latest rendition of the Sport Psych Concepts lecture series. Today I'm going to continue on my train of thought on sports psychology for coaches, and this time getting into mental skills training and some of the specific things there, or specific ways that you can classify mental skills, some of the tools that you can use. And again, won't be totally exhaustive, but want to share some information that I think will be useful for coaches. I definitely encourage the coaches listening to go dig a little deeper into some of these things and just raise that awareness of what is available. Because obviously as coaches, we understand the importance of physical training, but we're going to shift and talk about the world of mental skills today. Okay, so some practical strategies, different psychological principles you can use to help those athletes build that mental fortitude they need to succeed under pressure. Now, I want to start by saying, we've all seen athletes who have just incredible physical talent, but they struggle under pressure. This is, of course, where those mental skills come into play. It's the psychological toolkit that allows athletes to perform at their best in those moments when they need to. So, in other words, regardless of what the circumstances are. And by intentionally teaching and reinforcing these skills, which is possible just like physical skills, we can have a profound impact on the athlete's individual performance, but also their career. We can help them perform well in these environments to enjoy the experience more, but also these are things that apply beyond the sporting realm, which is really crucial to understand. But coaches play a very, very important role in teaching these skills and reinforcing them. This isn't just in the realm of a sports psychology consultant, someone working in that mental performance space. Coaches have the most contact with their athletes and are in a key position to help implement some of these things. So let's start with probably the one term that comes to mind the most, right? I mean, maybe next to confidence, it's mental toughness. And what exactly is this? There's actually many different definitions, slight variations of this. It's not really about being fearless or emotionless, which sometimes there's perspectives out there that say that's what it is, but really it's just more about how an athlete responds to adversity and how they deal with those things. They can be faced with adversity, but they still can find a way to be effective. They still can find a way to be successful despite that adversity. It doesn't mean that they're fearless, doesn't mean that they're emotionless. It's just they find a way to still succeed in the face of repeated adversity, really. Now, there's lots of different models out there. And so one that's a classic is called the 4Cs model. So this is something that you can read in the literature on this. I didn't come up with this, but you've got the 4Cs. So you've got control, you've got commitment, you've got challenge and confidence, just a way to classify mental toughness. So athletes feel like they have a sense of control over their situation. They have commitment to their goals. They view challenges as opportunities rather than as threats, and they just have unwavering confidence despite the adversity that they're being faced with. Okay, so the key takeaway here that I want you to have just with this mental toughness thing, because there's all sorts of things on the internet and different ways that you can help athletes develop this mental toughness, which is really just put them in situations where they're faced with pressure, where they're faced with adversity, and and see how they respond to that, and then help them find better ways to respond to that so they persist and they continue and they work better. And that you can develop specific interventions about that. What are they telling themselves, right? What sorts of routines do they have? What images do they create in their mind? There's different tools that you can develop that. But the key takeaway, like I said, is that mental toughness is not just something that athletes are born with. It's a skill. It's a trait. It's something that's we can actively help them cultivate by the way that we create practices. We have to put them through hard things, and then they have to see that they can make it through those things and they still can find ways to succeed even through the adversity. So as I said, if it's not mental toughness that comes to mind, confidence might be the next one that comes to mind. And sport confidence is obviously a key predictor of success. And it's just essentially like we know confidence when we see it, we know it when we feel it, we know what it is. It's just our belief, or an athlete's belief in their own ability to achieve whatever their particular goal is. And it can come from multiple sources. This is an important thing to understand, including past accomplishments or other mastery experiences. That's a key source of confidence. Like we get confident when we succeed at doing what it is that we're doing, which there's important implications in understanding that, in that athletes need to be put in situations where they can succeed, where they can have accomplishments, they can achieve their goals, which means it's got to be the right level of competition. You've got to push them just hard enough, but not so hard that failure is imminent, because they're not going to continue to work in those instances, and that will squash their confidence. Okay, but it also can come from support that they receive from coaches and teammates. It can come from them observing others succeed. That would be like the vicarious experience that they can get by seeing other people who have been in similar situations as them, and they see them come back. So many coaches will show film of a team that was behind in the fourth quarter or near the end of the competition by so much, and then they came back from that and they found a way to succeed. They worked through that. So you can use those, and then you can link back to that. Now you find your team in that situation. Hey, remember we watched that film, and this team, we're that team now. We can succeed also. We have that's possibility for us. We can come back. We can do that. Okay, so seeing others succeed can be a powerful way to promote confidence. Okay, but as coaches, the key thing I want you to understand is that we can influence this strategically. Okay, and how we're providing feedback. It needs to be specific. It needs to be positive feedback. The way that we design training sessions, like I said, where athletes can experience success. It's still hard. It doesn't mean it's guaranteed success. You can instill a sense of false confidence, right, or overconfidence, because everything's so easy. All they do is experience success because you haven't pushed them enough. They haven't experienced just the brink of, like, well, what's the 50-50 chance here of us experiencing success versus failure, because that actually can be very motivating, because you don't know what the outcome is, and so you work really hard to see if you can determine it. Okay, so you can create practices and drills and things like that that encourage the athletes to learn from those things. And also, if an individual athlete maybe hasn't experienced success in a while, maybe they're going through a slump, they can learn from each other. They have teammates that are just going through success. Well, what is it that they're doing right now? What can you learn from them and see? Or this person went through a slump and they dug out and this is how they did it. So, there's something there. But ultimately, we want our athletes to understand that confidence comes from multiple sources, and we want to give them infusions of confidence in as many ways as we can. And there may be different needs for athletes depending on what their preferences are or what their experiences are. And so as coaches, we can sort of tailor our approach to helping them with those things in mind. So now we'll shift away from mental toughness and confidence, and we'll talk about the next sort of mental skills idea that I want to share with you today, and that is dealing with stress, coping with stress, stress management, different ways that we can describe that. Stress, of course, is a natural part of the sporting experience. And importantly, it's not always a negative thing. Sometimes it gets thrown around as that thing, but like people who are down in the trenches and we're working hard in sport, we understand we need a certain amount of stress. We have something to work against, to push on. It drives us. We can use that. But the key is that our athletes cope with it properly, and indeed that we cope with it properly as coaches. And so we can develop different coping strategies or help our athletes develop those strategies so they can effectively manage their stress. So you can divide the coping strategies, if we're going to categorize these, into two broad categories. So the first would be problem focused coping, and the other would be emotion focused coping. So problem focused coping, what this is it involves taking some sort of direct action just to change the stressful situation. Like you're practicing a difficult skill. Okay, it's like, oh well, we won't work on something so hard. Now it's not as stressed, right? It's problem focused. We're doing something that's within our control. We can change something. Whereas emotion focused coping, on the other hand, that's about managing the emotional response to the stressor. So for this, we might use some sort of relaxation technique or breathing. We have some sort of mantra. We do some meditation. Um, Maybe you even, if you can't remove yourself from the situation, which would be more of a problem-focused coping strategy, right? You're in the situation. It's like, how do we manage it? I don't have as much control over this situation to really just change it, so I can't solve the problem per se. So I'm just going to focus on managing my emotions to deal with the stress response. Okay, and so there's this goodness of fit idea, sometimes referred to as like the matching hypothesis. There's different ways that this is described, but essentially we want to help our athletes develop a wide range of coping skills so then they can select the most appropriate one for a given situation. And this is what you may see with some athletes, is some athletes only know how to cope in one particular way, and it may not be the best way for the particular situation. So we can help them broaden their repertoire of ways that they can respond in these situations so they have more tools. So then they can demonstrate this matching hypothesis, match whatever the stress management technique, the coping technique is, or strategy, to what the situation is. Okay, so if we have some control over it, we use a problem focused approach. If we don't have much control, we use more of an emotion focused approach. So very, very practical tips right there that I think that many coaches will find helpful. All right, so in a somewhat related vein, I want to talk about challenge states now and threat states, just different mental states that we're in. And there's this model out there called the biopsychosocial model, and so some of this is rooted in that, which you can look into that and read more about that. But essentially, it's just this idea that athletes they're constantly evaluating their competitive situations, and there's many different factors. There's biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors that are at play and will affect how they're interpreting what it is that's going on as they're evaluating that. So if they feel like they have the resources to meet the demands of what the situation is, they experience what's called a challenge state. Okay, so it's like, here's a challenge, but I have the resources to meet the demands, and so I'm going to go out here and face the challenge. But if they feel more overwhelmed, like they're not sure, or they really doubt that they have the resources to meet the demands, maybe they think their opponent is just better than them, then it becomes a threat state. Okay, so the critical distinction here is that when they're in a challenge state or mindset, that leads to a more efficient physiological response by itself, but then psychologically they make better decisions, and ultimately they're going to have better performance. So our goal as coaches here is to help athletes consistently reframe the situation that they're faced with as challenges. Okay, it's like, here's this challenge. It's a challenge. It's not a threat. It's a challenge. So what is it that we have that we can leverage, that we can approach the situation really as a challenge? And it's really just a reframe. It's how they're interpreting the situation. And so we help them be nimble in their mind on how they're viewing the situation, what they're telling themselves, so they're in more of a challenge state in their mind rather than perceiving it as a threat. So to take this idea a little bit further and really answer more of the question of how we help our athletes adopt more of that challenge mindset with relation to what I was saying about, resources, we start by enhancing their perceived resources. Okay, so this could include building some of their confidence, like I talked about before, and then just helping them feel more prepared. So, what it is that we're doing in practice and training as it leads up to competition, we can do that. But we also need to be mindful of how we're framing the demands of a situation. Okay, so for example, we're saying, oh, this is a must win. Like, we got to win this game. Okay, so that changes the situation in their mindset. That can push it toward a threat. We're like, oh, well, I don't really know if we have the control over that, and so now I'm viewing this as a threat, and so I'm going to play not to lose instead of playing to win sort of mentality. So instead of saying this is a must win, we can say, hey, our focus is to execute what our strategy is. We're going to bring everything that it is that we have today and do everything that we can to increase our chances of winning. Right? It's a little bit more of a shift there, but that shift in our language can help our athletes see the demands as something manageable and controllable. They're focusing on executing their strategy. They're focusing on bringing their best effort, doing everything that they can to win the game, rather than saying, oh, we must win, that sort of either or mentality, that all or nothing mindset. Okay, so just those sorts of little shifts, that's what I was talking about before, saying we have this reframe to now we point them more in the direction of a challenge state instead of a threat state mentally. So another tool that could be helpful in those situations where they maybe are feeling that it's more of a threat, or maybe the situation calls for more of an emotion focused coping strategy, there's another tool that could be tied in there, and that is of course mindfulness training. And when athletes are in the heat of competition, it can be easy for their mind to wander, particularly toward things that could go wrong in that situation. So mindfulness training overall, the idea is just to bring our attention back to the present moment. So when you put athletes through training, that's what you're trying to do, is bring their attention back into the present moment. So it's not about emptying their mind, right? It is called mindfulness, right? It's not about mind emptiness, it's about mindfulness. But so we're bringing their mind back into the present. We're observing their thoughts and whatever they're feeling, sensations, but without judgment. Okay, so there's this intentionality that's a key part of this. We're intentionally observing thoughts and feelings, but we're not judging them. We're not saying they're good. We're not saying they're bad. We're not having some sort of emotional reaction to them that then we're also judging that. We're just observing. We're noticing. We're experiencing. And so this can include really simple techniques. You do a body scan, start head to toe or go toe to head, another direction. You could just do your hands. Sometimes I'll do that. I'll just scan from on a micro level, like all of my fingers, do these individual scans, and my hand just down into from my elbow to my hand. So it doesn't have to be your full body scan. Or you could do some sort of focused breathing. You're just paying attention to that. But the idea here is athletes, when athletes do this, you train them to do these things by doing these sorts of drills, they learn to calm their nervous system down. They can better manage their performance anxiety and actually stay in the zone, because then they're focusing on things that are relevant, right? Or they're get better at not being distracted. They may notice some sort of distracting thought, but then they don't have to pay attention to it. They can just notice it and then let it go, and then focus in back on the things that are relevant and that they need to do. Okay, so mindfulness training, this is certainly one of those things that much more could be said about this, but for coaches, it's a simple tool. And so I encourage the coaches who are listening to go and explore this more if it's something that's of interest to you, because as I said, there's a lot out there that can give you some ideas on how to implement these things with your athletes. All right, so what about performing under pressure? Here's I've talked about some specific things, and now we have this more almost a just a different way of phrasing some of what we talked about with mental toughness and how we're coping in these threat states, like performing under pressure and what does that mean. But the specific thing or concept that I want to bring in relation to this is choking, right? So a lot of athletes' worst nightmare where they're well rehearsed, they're well practiced, they're really good at what it is they're doing, and then all of a sudden it falls apart when they get under this pressure situation. And in many instances, there's different hypotheses here, but it can be caused by the athlete just overthinking, where their skill, whatever it is that they're doing, used to be more automatic, and now they start thinking consciously about that skill again and how they're executing it, and so then that interferes with that automaticity that used to be there. Okay, so there's different ways, but ultimately it's performance that they should be better at, and then they're not as good as they should be. And it really can be challenging when it's on a broad scale and there's publicity and everything around this as athletes choke. And I think that even on a broader level, there's some misunderstanding on it, like because sometimes athletes, well, it's not really a choke. We're calling that a choke, but maybe it's not actually a choke. They just didn't actually execute. But was it a choke, or is it just that that's the nature of sports sometimes? That you just don't perform as well as other times. So it's like there's this expectation socially that you're always going to perform at your best in those peak moments, when the reality is it's just that it doesn't always happen that way. And so sometimes it's a choke, but other times maybe it's not actually a choke, but it gets attributed as if it is. So that's a little aside there. But when we're thinking about this as coaches and we want to combat this, there's different strategies we can use, like pre-performance routines, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But pre-performance routines can be really good. It can be something simple, a series of breaths that an athlete takes. It can be a specific sequence of movements, whatever it is that can help the athlete get into the right mindset and focus on the task at hand. If they got different distractions or they got anxiety, these other things, they're focusing on what it is they need to do. So mindfulness training can also be something there, getting out of their head, getting into their body, feeling, having different cue words and things where they initiate a movement, and then they stay in tune with that automaticity because they're not making it happen, they're letting it happen. So a very interesting area to consider, but definitely something to be aware of. So when athletes are faced with those situations, they have a response, and the coaches are in a good position to help them with that. So to talk a little bit more about pre-performance routines in particular, this can be a powerful tool for preventing choking, because a lot of choking examples we see, they're in sort of discrete closed skill situations. Like you think about golfing, is it's a discrete closed skill to where it's just like there's a very distinct beginning and an end to that skill. It's not in response to some changing thing in the environment, and they're not making adjustments along the way with their swing. Like once they initiate it, it's happening the way that it's hardwired in there. And so those are usually the type of instances that we think of for this. It could include some other situations, right? But many times this is what we're talking about. A pre-performance routine makes a whole lot more sense for these things than it does, say, a basketball player that's responding to the dynamic situation of the game, and they can't really execute a pre-performance routine unless they're shooting a free throw, right? Okay, so just know that's kind of what I'm talking about. We're talking about these pre-performance routines and where they're useful, but it can be helpful for preventing choking. The key thing here when we're coming up with these with athletes is to keep them simple and not overly ornate. Some athletes, I've talked to them and it's like almost too much, and so simplifying that can be helpful for them. So it needs to be simple. Number one, needs to be some sort of consistent sequence. One thing leads to the next. That can include their thoughts, what they're telling themselves, and the actions, right, that they can always rely on. They have some control, and then they have an automaticity. It's really cool. You look at swimmers on the when they're about to start a race, when they're up on the platform and they go through their routine, a lot of similarities there. with, just in how that's put together. As say you have a golfer, you have a basketball player shooting a free throw, you have someone who is in shooting sports like archery or shotgun shooting, those sorts of things. There's very specific routines, and it's pretty cool. Thoughts and actions, very consistent. Okay, so like I said, if we have a basketball player, their routine, just to give you a specific example, might be, well, they take a deep breath, specific number of dribbles, then they have some sort of final visual. They say something to themselves, they see the ball going through the net in their mind, and then they shoot it. So the routine, what it does, and I remember my college coach helping me develop a routine, and it just provides structure. It gives you something to think about. So you have a sense of control, so you're not as susceptible to some of those other distractions. So things that can take away your focus from where it needs to be. So it keeps you, the athlete, in that challenge state. It helps them stay there. So they're focusing on the process of execution rather than the pressure of the outcome. Okay, the process of execution rather than the pressure of the outcome. So they just stay in the moment, they're connected, they're present, they're focusing on executing the process, initiating those key things that are going to be the catalyst for everything else that's going to come. And they're not thinking about, oh, if I don't make this, then this, or oh, what's the score? This other person just did this. Those things aren't helpful in those instances. So again, pre-performance routines, another one of those things. Lots of good stuff on the web. Encourage you to look up more if you're interested in that. So to bring it all together now, after I've shared some of these examples, and there's more examples, but these are some useful ones, I think, for coaches to consider. But to be truly effective, we shouldn't look at each of these things as being a separate subject, which is why I tried to kind of weave them together and link them as I was talking about them, because we want them to be integrated into every practice. We don't want to compartmentalize. If we're coaches, like, oh, well, when am I going to do these things? And many coaches, they do this actually. It's like even coaches that I've consulted with, they'll let me work with their team and do things, and it's never as part of practice. It's always a separate thing, a separate session. It's before practice, it's after practice, it's its own time, it's not connected, it's always compartmentalized. Okay, but the ideal way to implement a mental skills program, mental skills training, is to integrate it within everything else that is already going on. Okay, so as coaches, the way you speak, the feedback you provide, the climate that you're creating, all of those are teaching opportunities to link in these mental skills. And developing these things, it's a journey, it's a long-term process. There's got to be patience, consistency, but if you make it a priority, you're going to develop better athletes, right? But also, you're going to be building more resilient and well-rounded individuals, because these skills, unlike a lot of the physical skills and the technical skills, those sorts of things, those are very context specific. The mental skills apply in other domains in life, which makes them exceptionally valuable. So to summarize, I can't say how important the coach's role is in this sort of mental skills aspect. It goes far beyond the physical training for sure. And so to become a sort of mental skills trainer, mental skills coach, someone that includes those things, you when you do that, you're equipping your athletes to navigate those pressure situations. It's not just more technical skills that are going to get them there. Obviously, they need to have the technical skills, need to be able to understand strategy and execute those things, but they're going to be able to navigate those pressure situations and enhance their performance by doing that. And ultimately, they'll have greater enjoyment in sport. If they're mentally tough, they're going to be able to enjoy it more, because they're going to be able to handle those difficult times, those ups and downs that inevitably come. So we build that mental toughness, confidence is high, those coping skills, they have the right mindset, and they're developing that by being mindful, and they have different routines and all the things that I talked about in the presentation. That's where you get, like I said, those resilient, successful athletes, but also as individuals. Certainly a worthy byproduct of what it is that we're doing as coaches. So thanks for listening to the presentation. Again, as always, hope it was helpful, and I'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.